The paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers.
I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Hi, my name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. My guest today is Lois Lee. She is the president and chairman of Children of the Night. Hi, Lois. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Nick?
I'm good. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm the founder and the president of Children of the Night. And Children of the Night is an organization, a nonprofit that's dedicated to rescuing children from the ravages of prostitution. And we've been at it for 43 years. We've rescued over 11,000 kids. I started in 1979 before the word trafficking was invented by the Department of Justice. I've seen it all. I first took kids in my home, and over a 3-year period, took over 250 kids through my apartment. I set up a drop-in center in the heart of Hollywood, set up street teams all over the western region of the United States. I set up a 24-bed shelter home. It was a world-class home, had a private school. Kids went snowboarding, the beach, entertainment centers every Friday. It was a pretty amazing place. Nike dressed them. Designer jean companies donated all of the clothing. It was a really exciting place. And then from there, now we have a mobilized case management. We've moved offices and online. We took our school online. So we do online tutoring for the high school diploma. And all of the changes in the program were a result of was a result of need, what was needed at the time, what worked and what didn't work. Just because you create a program doesn't mean that program is good forever. You need to constantly, annually evaluate your program, look at your numbers, see what's going on. You have to pay attention, to what's going on with laws and policy and what's coming ahead, so that you can stay ahead of the government, basically.
So in the early 1970s, you were a sociology graduate student and working on your PhD. And that ultimately came out, The Pimp and the Game. Was that your ultimate PhD thesis?
My PhD thesis was about prostitution, the social world of the female prostitute, everyone she interacted with, from the family to the pimp, to her children, to the police, to the customer, to the I guess that's it, whoever.
And how did you get involved in this? Like I said, like you said, you were doing this before the word trafficking even existed. What inspired you?
Well, I was in a PhD program in 1975, and I was told by my professors that I would have to study quantitative analysis. I could no longer do my interview data. My interview research, wouldn't accept that. So I'd gone to the National Sociology Conference in San Francisco and met Margaret St. James, who was holding an event across the street at the Glide Memorial Church. Told her I was looking for a dissertation subject. She introduced me to ACLU members in Oakland who had just sued the police department for not arresting the customers. And that meant the police could not bring a prostitute into the courtroom unless they brought the customer. And they suggested I do that with LAPD. And I came back to Los Angeles. I found a lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer who had a good prosecution background. We sued LAPD for not arresting the customers of the prostitutes. And I was really just nothing more than a statistician. I was teaching at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills, and ran my research team out of the criminal courts building, where we transferred the pertinent information we needed onto our research forums, and found that, something like 90% of the arrests were prostitutes, 10% were customers. But they balanced in terms of, a lot of more male prostitutes. So they didn't find that it was unconstitutional because it was fairly equal male, female. I think you could safely say that I'm the reason that they started arresting customers, where they stick female police officers on the street and have them act as decoys to try and, get an interest to solicit them. In those court cases, I met, 30, 40 prostitutes, and 2 girls I'd met. One, I'd gone out on the streets because the thing that shocked me about the research is the most common age was 19. So I went on the street to talk to the girls and found out that none of them had a legitimate ID. It was just that that was the prevalence of the ID that was going around at the time, was a 19-year-old ID. And what happened was I met 2 girls who were killed by the Hillside Strangler in those court cases. And the second girl was Kimberly Martin, and the girl who ran the escort service, who was a heroin addict, called me, told me that she sent a girl to a place to meet a guy. The address didn't exist, and the phone was, he wasn't answering the phone, and we knew that, she had been lured. And I called the police and tried to get the police to go, and they wouldn't send out a car because she was just a whore. And they said, she just changed trick houses on you. And fortunately, I called the reporter, KMBC Warren Wilson, who had been covering my court cases, and said to him, literally, get up, we got another one. And he took a camera crew out to the location, and sure enough, that was the only lead the police had after 10 girls had been killed, about how they got girls and where they killed the girls. And they continued to fumble the investigation for some years after that.
They were an evil duo, that's for sure.
Yeah, and there's several documentaries out now. I'm in all of them.
And you wrote The Pimp and His Game. And
yes, that was really my master's thesis.
Could you tell us about that?
Well, it was during the time of the civil rights movement, and in school we were required to read all of the civil rights literature, everything from Iceberg Slim to Man-Child of the Promised Land to Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. There was a big movement for Elijah Muhammad. He had a following. I went to school with Muslims at a university because they had a special program, and they had a prison parole program I was very actively involved in. And as I read through the literature, I was really shocked about how the men treated the women, and how there was such separatism in terms of that, even in the organizing efforts, the men would come together and the women were not allowed in. And I was even more surprised by the response of the women, because if sometimes someone's mean to you or ignores you, you go away. But not always in this case. It was certainly used as a strategy. And I think probably premise of most of the strategies of pimps is, for a good game player, would be where they pretend rejection in order to increase desire. They call it prating. And so I went through the literature and I developed 22 tried and true strategies. I was very young. I was like 24 years old. And I went through it, and I used to joke about it and say, hey, look, here's 22 tried and true strategies of how you can get a woman to do whatever you want. But because I had no attachment to the issue, I had never met anyone who was actually a prostitute at that time. And as time went on, it turned out that I really had a piece of research that became very, very, it was my best piece of research, and it became very prominent in the world of prostitution and law enforcement, and for the prosecution in the Department of Justice. And I was used in order to prosecute several pimps and the new laws. I mean, some pimps were put in jail for life. So it was the beginning. And then as times moved on, and the police and Department of Justice wanted to exploit these children as witnesses rather than help them and take their cooperation voluntarily, we went our separate ways, and they no longer used me as an expert. I wouldn't lie for them.
You originally started this from your apartment, and
yes,
you've grown. I think I read that you put up a couple of girls when you were in graduate school. And
well, what happened was that when the Hillside Strangler, the night that the police refused to go out, the next morning I was all over the media because I had the clues. And I was very angry at the police. And I said, if you're involved in the prostitution business and you think you know who the Hillside Strangler is, don't call the police, call me, and put my home phone number up nationwide. And fortunately, ABC and NBC gave me full-time reporters to work with me, and KFWB gave me a full-time reporter, and we split up the clues. My home phone number became the underground for tips from the underground. And so I went out and met organized crime figures and strip club owners and pornographers and pimps and everybody. And became very friendly with the pimps, not socially friendly, but to where they were comfortable calling me up or coming to my house going, is my girl here? I don't want any trouble. I just don't want the police looking for me, because they were afraid she'd end up dead and they'd go to jail for murder. So that's how the kids ended up in my house, because, you know, people would own the nightclub said, I don't want kids in my business, but the guy working at the door, he and his buddies think it's funny to give her a Quaalude and put her on stage, and please get these kids away from me. And there were tons of them. And I kept telling the police, these are children. They didn't believe me for a long time. And there's one vice cop who thought, okay, I'll give you a shot at it. And I had a 13-year-old they put in the adult jail, and she was 5'11". And I said, she's 13 years old. He says, no, she's not. And he says, and everybody's screaming here, tell Lois, get out of our system. Our system's fine. I said, I'm telling you, she's 13 years old. I'm talking to the mother. And he said, have the mother go to the Riverside police station and teletype her birth certificate to us. And he did, and he went back. He said, she's right. This girl's 13. I want her out of juvenile. I want her out of jail immediately. So they transferred her to juvenile hall. That's how crazy it was. And then she had a court date, and I went down for the court date. And lo and behold, they had the court date a day earlier than what was on the forms. And the judge said, what is Lois doing? This is an 18-year-old. If I've ever seen an 18-year-old, send her back to adult jail. So we had to move her back again. And that's when I started to develop some real true believers in law enforcement who stuck with me. And I mean, I introduced them to 12, 13, 14-year-old kids who are working as prostitutes. They were appalled because regardless of what you think about police officers, they tend to be married or divorced. They have children, you know, and so they have feelings too. And so there was if it wouldn't have been for LAPD and those few officers and they grew in numbers, it would never got off the ground.
I wrote an article for the Alternative Weekly in Minneapolis. That's where I'm from. I live in New York City, but there was a serial killer killing prostitutes, and the cops would not cop to that. And I found it was like 50 women that had been stabbed, strangled, or beaten to death in a 10-year period. And I showed them the list, and I said, "Do you guys still really want to say that there's not a serial killer in the Twin Cities?" And shortly thereafter, after the article was published, a task force was formed. And
Yeah.
they're very expensive task force, because you've got to provide for a number of different officers and a number of different agencies. And police are reluctant to do that, especially if someone's killing prostitutes. If someone's killing upper socioeconomic women in like a ritzy suburb, then they're right on it. But prostitutes walking the streets at night, there just didn't seem to be much interest in pursuing that.
Well, it was interesting because I received several calls from communities and from law enforcement to come in and with other murders, particularly the Green River murder. And I said, you know, you guys, all I'm going to do is come in and talk to the prostitutes. And any of your vice cops working for you, if you would get off your high horse of being a homicide detective and talk to your vice cops, they have the same relationships I do. They can coordinate the witnesses because the girls know. They may not know that they know, but they certainly know that when the guy's arrested, that they knew that guy.
You've helped like 10,000 girls.
11,000.
11,000.
And I stopped counting, and then there's more. I mean, I guess I could add them all up if I wanted to, but what's the point?
So that's a pretty phenomenal record, and 70 to 80%. I graduate from high school, go on to college. I mean,
It's not dependent on criminal activity. I mean, some of them are CEOs, PhDs. Some of them, the most embarrassing thing in their life is to try and explain to me how they know me. We just had a graduation ceremony for high school graduation ceremony for our current clients. And I brought in alumni to present diplomas. And one of the young women who's a banker in Detroit. And she said to me, you know, I know so many women who were in the shelter the same time I was. And They just don't want anything to do with children of the night. They're embarrassed. They don't want anyone to know that was part of their life. And I called her after the event and I says, do me a favor. I says, tell them that I personally destroyed any paper copies and have deleted out of my database anyone I've not had contact with for 3 years. So I don't know who they are, and nobody's ever going to find out who they are because that data is not retrievable.
So you're basically one stop. If you've got like a 1-800 number, and if someone calls you from Florida, I mean, you'll help them.
Absolutely.
Could you take us through that process? You get a call from underage girl who's stuck in prostitution, and she's calling you from Tampa Bay. I mean, what would you do?
Well, they're all the same. It doesn't really matter where they are. If she's saying, help me get away from this guy, I'm going to go right through my routine. Where are you? How old are you? Do you have a way of getting out of there? What do you look like? What are you wearing? Do you have tattoos? Will he let you get in a cab? If I send an Uber, will he let you get in the cab thinking that a trick's in it for you? Is there a safer time to walk away? Is he going to put you back on the corner? I could have someone scoop you up. How do you feel about involving law enforcement? Let's go. And so, you have to, I give the caller, if they're involved in prostitution and they've survived out there, I give them a tremendous amount of respect and control out of the rescue, because they're there in that situation and they know what they're dealing with. They know if there's guns, they know if they're going to get shot in the back. I can't tell that from the telephone. So that's the first thing, is getting them to a safe location. And sometimes the pimp or trafficker will follow them, and we have our own places nationwide, chain places, where we will take them in and drop them off in a Uber. They go through, they go out the next door, and another Uber picks them up. So we're real good at ditching pimps. We've become really good at that. And then it's a matter of getting her to a safe location where we can talk. And where there's lots of people around and there's lights. I mean, a department store will do I used to use emergency room hospitals until COVID, because that no longer worked, because you had security, you had phones, you had lights, you had people. So we look at a place like that before we go on to anything else. And if she wants to go after that point, that's fine.